So in today's session we are talking about remembering war, which is to say we are going to examine the ways in which the experience and the legacy of war is remembered through both personal and collective modes of representation. It will entail examining formal sites and rituals of commemoration and the politics that surround them. It will entail thinking about the tensions between private and public memories of war, and it will lead us to examine the changing representations of the soldier's experience as seen through literature. It is important to state at the outset that the study of remembrance is necessarily also that of forgetting. As the German critic Walter Benjamin wrote, every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concern threatens to disappear irretrievably. In other words, the default in many ways in societies is for forgetfulness, is for the passage of time to erase memory. In fact, it's a basic psychological requirement for humans to be able to forget. If we couldn't forget, then every moment we experience would always be at the forefront of our minds, and that would mean every moment of suffering, of trauma, of embarrassment, of shame would be consciously present to our mind. Our psychic persistence requires some forgetfulness, and indeed in society as well. If no conscious effort is made to remember, to inscribe things, then the default is for forgetfulness. So when we talk about remembrance, we are talking about a selective form of memory. It entails that we are thinking about what we choose to collectively remember. And that is very significant, of course. What societies choose to commemorate says something about how they view themselves and how they determine the past as informing the present. We remember incidents, we remember historical times because we believe that it has a direct pertinence and relevance to our present and should in many cases be seen as a guide to the future. So it's therefore not surprising that when we think of remembrance and commemoration that we see a prominent role attached to ritual. What is a ritual? A ritual is a stylized and repetitive ceremony. By definition, a ritual is something that we repeat and we rehearse. And again, we can see that inscription of memory in the ritual. We repeat the same kinds of actions, same kinds of words, same kinds of expressions, because we want to retain them. We also, of course, see within commemoration a very important role for symbolism. Whether it's monuments or landmarks, there are certain kinds of recurrent symbols, associations, visual and ideational, that are foregrounded in order to create strong associations between visions of the past and certain ideas. The historian Pierre Nora, therefore, insists that the most fundamental purpose of the site of memory is to stop time, to block the work of forgetting, to establish a state of things, to immortalize death, and to materialize the immaterial. Time is a flow that escapes us and is inherently immaterial. But when we construct monuments, when we build statues, and through the enactment of ceremonies, we give some materiality to what otherwise would be impermanent. Hence the centrality of a few injunctions very associated with sites of memory in the context of war. The line, "lest we forget," is one that we find inscribed in many monuments since the First World War. This idea that if we do not act to remember, then we will forget. And a correlate of that is another term, though, another expression that we hear quite often, the idea of never again. And this is associated especially with the Holocaust, but we've seen that idea associated with war more generally. The idea that if we do not remember the past, if we do not commemorate past wars, then we risk reproducing these same errors in the future, and therefore enunciating the idea that we should never again do this is a very important way of preventing its reoccurrence. All of this, I think, begs the question of whether commemoration, especially as we see it today, is not really a secularized form of religion. One of the etymologies of the word religion is links it to the Latin religare, which means to bind. And indeed, one of the ways in which we can think about religion, but also collective remembrance, is that it forms and maintains a bond between members of a society by providing a sense of common meaning and destiny. And it accounts for why collective remembrance is so important, so central to national myths and national narratives. Of course, commemoration and remembrance of the dead has always or traditionally been associated with religion, and that has been the case for war commemoration. This religious dimension has faded somewhat, of course, with the secularization of our societies, but the fundamental structure and ritual in many ways is a continuation of it. Anthony Smith has pointed how important memory is for the nation state and for the development and persistence of national consciousness. As he puts it, Anthony Smith, famous scholar of nationalism, no memory, no identity. No identity, no nation. So an equation between memory, identity, and nationhood. And therefore it's not surprising, of course, that states quite consciously promote certain memories and forms of remembrance, that all state narratives make great use of commemoration as one of the sites and occasions in which national narratives can be told. In particular, one of the narratives that is very prominent in war commemorations today is the idea that warfare and its remembrance constitute the nation as a sacred community of sacrifice. This is an expression of John Hutchinson. And of course, scholars of nationalism have pointed to how nationalism in many ways is itself a secularized form of religion, a way of creating a sense of community and collective in a world in which religious belief has declined. We could point here to the common etymology between sacred and sacrifice, and that accounts for the ways in which sacrifice at war is imbued with a kind of religious or sacred character. This is perhaps best exemplified by the Cross of Sacrifice, which is a war memorial found in Commonwealth war cemeteries around the world. Effectively, pretty much any war cemetery that contains at least 40 graves of Commonwealth soldiers will have this Cross of Sacrifice, which, as you see, is a cross and in which is also inscribed or affixed a sword. Equating, of course, sacredness and sacrifice, the sword and the cross. Now, when we think about the sacred character of remembrance, it also helps to appreciate why any perceived disrespect for symbols or sites of remembrance are frequently treated as sacrilegious. That's to say, as a violation of the sacred, and as a consequence, opprobrium is heaped on any party that is deemed to be sacrilegious in this fashion. A couple of examples. In 2010, during student protests, this one individual, Charlie Gilmer, was photographed swinging from flags on the cenotaph. This was front page news. He was vilified for his disrespect of the monument. And this was quite exemplified. I mean, this is one out of many other news stories that have point to disrespect to what probably is the centerpiece of commemoration in the UK, which is the cenotaph. Similarly, a few years ago, there were front pages criticizing the BBC TV show Top Gear for driving sports cars and doing wheelies around the cenotaph. Another case is illustrated by, could be illustrated by a number of individuals, but it has to do with the remembrance poppy. The Man United player Nemanja Matic refused to wear a poppy in 2018. The reason he gave is that he had childhood memories of being bombed by NATO in his native Serbia in 1999 during the Kosovo War, and therefore did not feel comfortable wearing a poppy that he saw as promoting the British military. Another footballer, James McLean, an Irish footballer, also has refused to wear a poppy. His reasons are what he sees as the role of the British Army during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Of course, here we have these, in the case of these two individuals, and this is other examples could be given of individuals who have been singled out for not wearing the poppy, public figures. They, of course, received a lot of hostile comments, particularly on social media, and received opprobrium on that basis. And of course, so this is again illustrative of the fact that forms of commemoration, symbols of remembrance, really are imbued with a quite unusual degree of sacredness, and stepping outside of it or visibly disrespecting it is seen as beyond the pale, at least by some people. These cases also illustrate an important point, that the meaning of a poppy, or any symbol of commemoration for that matter, it can be quite different according to individuals. The associations that are made regarding it are not necessarily consistent ones. Indeed, one of the issues around Remembrance Day, the events of commemoration in the UK that is held on November 11, which was originally the commemoration of the end of the First World War, but has now become a commemoration for the victims and the participants of all wars. Remembrance Day and the red poppy appeal, which is associated with it, are undoubtedly the most consensual forms of commemoration in Britain, and are generally supposed to not only transcend political differences, but even, many would hold, to be apolitical. But this is not by any means a universally shared view. Some have expressed the view that the poppy appeal uses remembrance of the fallen in the wars of the 20th century as a means to legitimize contemporary military action. And this is not necessarily a view that is a recent one. In the 1930s, already pacifists created the white poppy because they believed that the red poppy had become associated with military power and the justification of war. And to this day, people do bear white poppies when they want to pay homage to the fallen of past wars, but do not want to wear a red poppy because they consider that it has certain political affiliations, or that it entails some form of support for contemporary military action or for the institution of the military as a whole. The historian Reinhard Koselleck points out, importantly, that it is not only, therefore, the death of soldiers itself that serves political purposes, but rather, or as well, the remembrance of them that gets put to political service. And of course, it's not difficult to think of a variety of ways in which memory is put to political uses. When we think, and of course we're concerned here with the ways in which wars are commemorated, when we look at national narratives and the instilling of national pride, the fact that individuals identify with their national history or feel a particular sense of pride in being a member of a national community, these are very often tied to perceived moments of unity in victory and sacrifice. And of course, interstate wars provide some of the most obvious occasions for this. We can think of the ways in which the Second World War is lionized in the UK, thought of as the country's finest hour. And it's very clear the ways in which the Second World War continues to resonate in the public imaginary in the UK and is deeply woven in the sense of British national identity. In the Soviet Union or in Russia, the Second World War serves a similar function as the Great Patriotic War, and a commemoration of Russian sacrifice and ultimately victory in the Second World War, which has transcended the collapse of the Soviet Union, which fought that actual war, and is very much at the center of contemporary Russian narratives of a national identity. Other countries, events like revolutions or wars of national independence play a similar role. In France, for instance, of course, the French Revolution is also seen as kind of foundational for the identity of that country. Countries who've gone through phases of processes of decolonization will also tend to see their wars of national independence as a critical affirmation of national unity and so forth. Of course, these are always very simplistic narratives that involve telling a very linear, homogeneous story about these events. The reality of them is also obviously much more complex. But to the extent that these narratives are successful in establishing themselves, they play a very important role in the national sense of identity. It's interesting, however, to note that this is not only moments of triumph that can be woven into national narratives, but moments of defeat and humiliation can also play an important role in historical narratives. Sometimes the defeat might be something that present governments insist on recalling because they associate with a past regime. So in order to distance themselves from that regime or to recall a past that is now left behind, some humiliating defeat can sometimes be insisted upon. Or defeat can be used to instill a sense of shame and a necessity for revenge, for some kind of righting of a wrong. This was very prevalent in France after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, where France was defeated by Prussia. And this led to this, what was called the spirit of revanche, the revenge, if you want. And this was something that was insisted on a lot for several decades and played a big role in the ways the French saw the outbreak of the First World War. This was the opportunity for France to wipe away its humiliation of the defeat to Prussia, to take back lost ground, and to get its own back. Something akin to that was also encouraged within or developed within the post-war Germany, post-First World War Germany, in the Weimar era, and of course, which led ultimately to the rise of the Nazis. A great sense of historical injustice in terms of the loss of the First World War, the treatment of Germany after it, all of which fueled demands for another conflict or for some kind of righting of that wrong. Narratives can also, the narratives can also be shaped in ways that become foundational for political movements thereafter. We think about the way the Second World War has, in the European context, and largely been reframed as a European catastrophe. In fact, in the European context, the First World War and the Second World War are seen together as a legacy of European disaster, in which it really is not so relevant to determine who won or who lost, but rather that the lesson that should be learnt from it is that a different kind of politics should emerge from it. And you can see how this idea of the Second World War as a European catastrophe was a major spring and continues to play a very big role in the construction of the European Union. The idea is the European Union is required in order to escape from the tragedy of the European wars of the first half of the 20th century. Here it's important, of course, to point to the specificity of the UK again, in the sense that the Second World War is not really seen as a European catastrophe in Britain, or at least the experience of Britain is seen again as a great moment of national triumph, an affirmation of British character. And again, there's no doubt that has played a non-negligible role in the whole Brexit event. There's an attachment to a kind of independent UK and to a glorious moment in British history that does not, I think, share in the dominant narrative of the Second World War as catastrophe that is generally shared, I think, across continental Europe. Finally, we can see political uses of memory in the form of historical analogies, the ways in which politicians, commentators will reach for historical precedent in order to argue for particular policies in the present. So whenever governments want to agitate for military action against another state, typically they will invoke Munich and appeasement, the idea that the Western Europeans or the British, the French and so forth appeased Hitler, did not meet him when they should have, and led to a bigger disaster in the long run. And so we've heard this about Saddam Hussein and about other political leaders. If we don't do something, if we don't act now, if we don't go to war now, we are guilty of appeasement. We are laying in front of a dictator, a new Hitler. We will lay the ground for a greater catastrophe further down the road. The model or the example of Pearl Harbor in the US plays a big role. It is regularly invoked to suggest a threat of a surprise attack, that the US might be, if the US is not careful, it will be open, vulnerable to another Pearl Harbor, an attack it didn't see coming, as it didn't see coming the Japanese attack on its Hawaiian base in 1941. And so that extends to metaphors about an electronic Pearl Harbor, a cyber Pearl Harbor, that the US is unprepared for a cyber attack that will disarm it or will seriously damage its interests. We've also seen the ways in which the Vietnam War has haunted the US for quite a long time. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, there was a constant concern within the US that any new war would lead to another Vietnam. And in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, which was such a spectacular success for the United States, President Bush Sr. at the time delighted in saying that we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. And rejoicing in the idea that we no longer have to talk about Vietnam, because now we've fought this kind of clean, perfect war, and we can forget about this fear that haunted us for 2 decades. Now, of course, the wars of the last 2 decades perhaps set us up for another syndrome, an Iraq syndrome or an Afghan syndrome, once again. Anyhow, I think it's very clear that in an age in which we live in, where statues are being toppled, where the demand for removal of particular monuments is happening, that these are obviously political acts, but because the very choice, design and establishment of statues and monuments are also political. Whenever we're talking about collective forms of commemoration, these are inherently political acts, even if they're not thought in political terms, but they're deeply associated with national narratives, profound senses of national identity, with the articulation of history and the meaning that we should derive from the past.